Man, I got my brother joining us today on the Bakari Sellers podcast. He's a New York Times bestselling author, but he has been gracious enough to spend a few minutes with us today. Adam, what's going on, brother? How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing? Thanks so much for having me.
I'm more blessed than I deserve, brother. Look, we usually start each one of our episodes the same way, and we like for individuals to walk us through the arc of their career. And you've worked your way up from a number of newsrooms to now being a regular contributor with the Atlantic. So why did you choose a career in journalism? And if you don't mind, walk us through the various stops that you've had from the American Prospect to your role now at the Atlantic.
Oh man, well, so I would actually say that this was somewhat accidental. I started off as I started off wanting to make documentaries, and that was what I wanted to do. That was what I went to journalism school for. But in 2008, there were not a lot of journalism jobs. And as it happened, I was working at, I had a sort of miserable setup prior to getting into journalism school, where I was working the graveyard shift at a local grocery store in the produce section. And I was working as a sound engineer for a studio that made books on tape for the blind and handicapped for the Library of Congress. And I was spending my waking hours playing World of Warcraft because I was miserable. And what I did was I basically weaned myself off of World of Warcraft by blogging. And that was back in 2007, 2006, 2008, where you could actually blog and like have people notice you. And I guess you can kind of do that now on Twitter, but it's very dangerous. But, you know, and so I started, so when I went to journalism school, I already had a blog, and the American Prospect invited me to guest blog for them. At the time, the blog was pseudonymous, but they said, you have to use your real name. And so I did that, and then they asked
What was
me
your
if I
name?
wanted to.
What was your blogger name?
My blogger name was DNA, which was a riff on an old high school nickname, which I will not repeat. Your audience will have to figure that one out. There's some people out there who know what it stands for, but I won't explain it. And so they invited me, and then they asked me if I wanted to apply for their fellowship, which was convenient for me because it was 2008. The economy was collapsing, and in particular, journalism as an industry was really struggling. This was before everybody had agreed to paywalls and metered paywalls and stuff like that. In fact, it was very controversial at the time to say, this was the information wants to be free era, which outlets were just, it was considered, people were very critical of your outlet if they instituted a paywall, and now, everybody has them. But so I started at the American Prospect, which was a lot of fun. It was a very interesting place to work because it was, I think this is when I fell in love with magazines, because the American Prospect is, a very what you might describe as a paleo liberal magazine, in that it's like very like sort of labor liberalism focused, very sort of traditional New Deal liberalism. And so it was an intellectual project, and I liked that about it. And I went from there to Mother Jones, which is a different kind of intellectual project. It's a liberal magazine, but it's much more focused on sort of reporting and investigative journalism, whereas the American Prospect was, and now they do reporting, but it was also at the time much more focused on ideas. And in some ways was a more left-wing, it's similar to the Atlantic where I work now in some ways, because it combines both reportage with a kind of intellectual let's talk and argue about ideas type stuff.
But it's
So
long
it
form
was for
too,
me.
so
Yeah,
you don't really get. I mean, you get the sustenance that you don't necessarily get from some of our political discourse today, which I refer to as being decently silly. But like, why did
yeah.
you choose? Why did you choose, particularly at the Atlantic and American Prospect, I guess? Why did
It
you
was
choose to
totally
write?
accidental. I mean,
Why'd you choose to write about race though? And I ask as someone who talks about race
oh,
quite a bit, that work comes with risk and death threats and exhaustion and chronicling all the daily aggressions. But why did you choose this work in particular?
I actually tried to avoid it at first. I think I, you know, I think it was sort of I think there was an expectation that this would be my focus, because my mother is Black and my father is Jewish, and so it was a topic of interest to me. But I sort of wanted to write about other things, so I spent a lot of time writing about immigration and civil liberties and stuff. But what happened was that our politics, I mean, race and racism really sort of was thrust into the center of our politics, for structural reasons, but also because of Barack Obama and the reaction, the backlash to Barack Obama. And so it was sort of accidental that I ended up writing about this stuff. I really tried to resist it at first. But there were things that needed to be said. And I think if you remember there were there's so many more Black writers now. I mean, even at the Atlantic, like we have a murderer's row of people. We have Clint Smith, we have Adam Harris, we have Hannah
Hmm.
Georges, we have Van Newkirk. We have so many people who are excellent. But like magazines at that time really did not have those kinds of rosters of Black writers, and in fact, a lot of them still don't. But there was, I mean, like, I think people forget about the way that Barack Obama was covered in 2008. Like there was a genuine like cultural blindness. Like a lot of prestigious outlets really did not have any idea how to cover race or how to cover Black people at all. There's a chat with the New York Times with someone who's like now a New York Times politics editor, who in 2008 was like, if you think about it, Obama is really more white than he is Black.
I
Because
don't
he
remember
like
that.
was
I
raised
missed
by,
that piece.
I mean, it's just, and I don't mean to pick on him in particular. That was the assessment. That was the kind of essentialized discourse that existed in 2008. And so there was, I mean, in some ways, Barack Obama's election forced this kind of integration of these elite publications because they needed people who could actually know what they were talking about. Um, and I think, it's less that I really wanted to write about this stuff than that the nature of the politics of the country just went fiercely in that direction, where the country became racially polarized on so many issues. I mean, there's a book by Michael Tesler, who's a political scientist, called Post-Racial or Most Racial, and he notes that opinions on Portuguese water dogs became racially polarized during the Obama administration for no other reason than that Barack Obama owned a Portuguese water dog. So this is like, in some ways, there's so many other factors in American society, but race, um, issues of race came to the forefront in part because of this, because of the election of the first Black president and because of the backlash to that election, which I think to this day continues to define our politics, in ways that are, in some ways scary and harmful, which is part
Let,
of, what the Cruelty Is the Point is about.
let's talk about, along those same lines. You just wrote one of the best pieces of the week. You get the award for the best piece of the week out of all of the periodicals
Thank
and
you.
journals. But you said Democratic leaders are betraying Black voters, which I agree with wholeheartedly. Talk to us about the reasoning behind this article. Everybody should go pick it up, but the gist of this piece as well.
I mean, this is really an old story in American politics, which is that um, uh, Black voters, whichever party that they're a part of, become sort of an essential constituency for universal political rights, because typically, traditionally, Black voters have been denied those political rights, and so the more universal they are, the more they're guaranteed, for Black Americans. And so this in the 1870s, at the end of Reconstruction, the Republican Party, the Democrats successfully disenfranchised Black voters, and that changed the nature of the Republican Party. You can see Frederick Douglass writing about this, where the Republican Party, he fears it's becoming a business-oriented corporate party because it's been severed from its working class Black constituency in the South. And in the 1930s, the reverse happens. Black voters, because they've been generally abandoned by Republicans, Black voters in the North go for Roosevelt because, despite the fact that the Democratic Party is the party of Jim Crow, their interventionist agenda is an economic agenda that appeals to Black voters in the North. And Black leadership is actually pretty slow in recognizing the appeal of the Roosevelt agenda to Black voters. But obviously the integration of Black voters into the Democratic Party completely changes the nature of the party from the party of Jim Crow to the party of civil rights. And because of the racial polarization of the parties, we have this sort of weird situation where the party of Lincoln is now seeking to sever Black voters or minimize their influence on the political process because they don't want to be accountable to them, and they want to prevent Democratic officials from winning elections. So the easiest way for them to do that, if they don't want to try and win those votes, is to try and minimize their influence or prevent Black people from voting in the first place. Now, the reason I went back to Reconstruction here is that the severing of Black voters from the Republican Party changed the nature of the party. And what you're seeing right now is an attempt by Republicans to change the shape of the electorate. They want to make it more right-wing, even if they're not successful in making sure that they win every election. To the extent that they are successful in minimizing the influence of Black voters, the country moves to the right, particularly on economic issues. And Democrats become less competitive. And to become more competitive, they will have to be less solicitous of the views of Black voters, who, after all, whose influence would be minimized, at least if the schemes that the Republican Party are engaging in at this particular moment are successful. And so for the Democratic Party—
along those same lines,
yeah,
can you draw that line for listeners from Shelby to this year's court case?
Yeah.
To the Republican efforts in legislatures across the country?
Right. I mean, there's this idea that Trump turned the Republican Party bad, but the truth is that John Roberts, since the 1980s, and this is an article I wrote for Mother Jones in 2013, I believe, was looking at his papers when he was a Justice Department lawyer in the Reagan administration. He was arguing against adding an effects test to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, because John Roberts fundamentally believes that attempts to address racism are more harmful than racism itself. And he particularly believes this when it comes to voting. So the Supreme Court, since 2013, since the Shelby County decision, has slowly blessed every effort that Republicans have made to minimize the influence of Black voters on the political process in the United States. And Democrats are now in office, and they often talk a good game about how, as Barack Obama said in 2016, democracy is on the ballot. And as Biden said, the soul of the country is at stake. But the problem is that Democratic leaders keep telling Black voters that their rights are on the line, which they are, and expecting them to come out in record numbers to rescue the Democratic Party from, the appeal of reactionaries like Donald Trump. But then once they win power, they don't use that power to defend Black rights. Now, there's a particular problem here, and the problem is largely in the Senate. It's Democrats like, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who are unwilling to change the Senate rules to allow voting rights legislation to pass with a simple majority.
But the fact remains, those two are also just giving cover to others who feel just like them, but who don't. They also giving cover to the Shaheens and the Testers of the world, et cetera.
It's likely that there are more Democratic senators than the ones who are publicly coming out against changing the rules. The problem is that this leaves the rights of the Democrats' most loyal constituency in limbo. And if you're and the Democratic Party really has a moral obligation to defend the rights of its historically marginalized constituencies, because we understand that when those constituencies lack the political power to influence the process, they are often subject to persecution and discrimination. And so, while I understand that, Tester in Montana and, Joe Manchin in West Virginia are serving very different constituencies. These are Trump states. They're serving very different constituencies than, senators in California. The fact remains is that the Democratic Party is not viable without the incredible commitment and motivation of Black voters, and they are not doing right by those voters in doing everything they can to defend their political rights. And that will have consequences for the Democratic Party down the road as well. It's not, to the extent that these Republican schemes maximize the influence of the Black vote and maximize the influence of conservative white constituencies across the country is successful, that is going to change the nature of American politics. And the sort of ideological and political diversity of the Democratic Party, which in other areas is a good thing, the homogeneity of the Republican Party is part of what has led it to down this authoritarian path. In this case, it is preventing them from acting with the necessary unity of purpose to defend the rights of their beleaguered constituencies, and that's a real problem.
So two questions here. Three questions here, and they all tie along the same path. What should Joe Biden and Washington Democrats be doing? And then what should Black folks be doing as they watch this calculus play out?
I honestly don't know the answer to these questions. I'm not a political strategist. I'm not a legislative expert. I can look at history and tell you what happened in the past. I can look at the present and tell you what's happening now. And I can tell you, what historically has occurred to parties whose constituencies power is minimized or marginalized in this way, and how that affects those parties. But it is definitely the case that, Joe Biden lacks leverage over someone like Joe Manchin because he's probably the only Democrat who could win in that state. But that doesn't actually change the nature of the fact that this is a broken promise to Black voters. If they do not act on a federal level to defend these rights from an assault that is both happening in the states and happening on the federal court level from the Supreme, from a majority of the Supreme Court justices, they have broken their promise to these voters to defend their rights, and that will likely have consequences as well.
How can folks find this latest piece? It's just online at the Atlantic, right? They should frame
it. It's on in the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Well, I think, a lot of people respond to me by saying, well, what should Joe Biden do? How can he twist Joe Manchin's arm? It's like, I don't have the answer to that question, but I don't think that's an argument against stating plainly what is happening here, which is that Democratic leaders made a promise to defend the rights of Black voters, and they have not fulfilled that promise. That's just a fact.
Well, look, if LBJ took the same position in calculus that Joe Biden is taking, then the Civil Rights Act would never been signed. I mean, that's using my historical analysis, and you are much more depth and nimble at understanding history as it relates to today than I, but that's my analysis. Let's talk about your new book, The Cruelty Is the Point. First, congratulations on getting a book done. I am struggling in the middle of my second book. Your book is a struggle, but it's a struggle because it's an emotional struggle for me, but it's a fantastic book, and I encourage everyone to read it. Talk about the title, because I feel like there was always this outrage about the cruelty around Trump. And I think you wrote a piece about cruelty or a tweet about cruelty back in the day that Republicans got all, or your counterparts on the right got all out of sorts on. But unpack the title and the gist of the book for listeners.
So, most people think about cruelty as an individual problem, and it is that. It's part of human nature. I can be cruel. Anybody can be cruel. If you ever been a child in a junior high school, you know how cruel children can be. And in fact, one of the apolitical examples of this that I give is that, if you've ever seen, a bunch of cool kids making fun of a nerdy kid, maybe you join in because you want to be a part of the cool kids group. Maybe you don't say anything because you're worried about drawing their attention. Or, maybe you're one of the few who might actually stand up for a kid like that in that situation. But the point is that this act of cruelty is an act of community formation. the kids who are picking on the kid who's alone are bonding with each other through this act of cruelty and transgression. And when I wrote that the piece that the book takes its title from in 2018, it was after a Trump rally during the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, where the president specifically, Christine Blasey Ford, who had accused Brett Kavanaugh and a childhood friend of sexually assaulting her when they were teenagers. She mentioned during her testimony that one of the things that she remembered the most was that was them laughing at her. And Donald Trump, at this rally, made this concerted effort to ridicule her. In other words, he made an effort to make his audience laugh at her. And this struck me because he zeroed in on sort of a vulnerability and he exploited it. And the people who he did that in front of, enjoyed it. They were having a good time. It was an act of bonding between the president and his supporters. And so the book is really focused on that kind of cruelty as a part of politics, specifically the way that it's used to demonize certain groups. So you can justify denying them their basic rights under the Constitution or exclude them from the political process. And this isn't inherently a partisan thing. I think it's a function of the relative diversity of the party's coalitions. If you are the Democratic Party and you have to unite hipsters in Dumbo with church ladies in South Carolina, you can't just like mock all kinds of people. On the other hand, if your party is largely made up of white Christians, you can act with a kind of contempt towards outside groups that your rival politicians can't do. And part of that is really structural. Our system incentivizes this kind of politics because it allows one party to hold power without winning a majority of the votes. And so it becomes even more urgent if you were the party representing that constituency to persuade them that they're on the verge of destruction, that anything they do to prevent that destruction is justified. And so that's how you end up where these acts of cruelty instead become, in their interpretation, heroic acts of self-defense of their community, which is the real America, against the fake America, which is destroying their way of life.
Let me ask you a question, Adam, because when I was writing your script today, I have one question on here which I thought was relatively stupid, and I still think it's stupid, but I think you're kind of answering it. But why do so many Americans sign on to this type of cruelty? I mean, from border separations to condoning a violent insurrection, how did we get here where people accept cruelty?
I mean, I think it's, like I said, I think it's part of human nature. But I also think it is, another example, my friend Ta-Nehisi Coates at an event.
Oh, my friend Ta-Nehisi. I don't even think the man exists. I've never met him.
he's the one person who fled the internet and has succeeded in never coming back. But he mentioned street harassment. So, when men holler at a woman on the street, holler obscenities on a woman on the street, they're not really expecting her to turn around and be like, yeah, let's go have lunch.
That doesn't work. Wait a minute. That doesn't work.
They're performing for the other men around them. And they're bonding in their placement of the woman in her place. And so I think, this is like a very powerful human impulse that is being exploited on a political level that can only be tempered by the kind of tolerance that is bred by sharing power with people who are different from you. And if you don't have to share power with people who are different from you, then you don't have to respect them. And I think that what the record shows throughout history, I mean, one of the other historical examples you can give is that, at the end of Reconstruction, you had this populist movement where white and Black workers in the South were starting to work together for their common interests. Mm-hmm. And that movement was essentially shattered by a Democratic Party campaign of white supremacy, whose purpose was to destroy this community that might have transcended race by creating a community that was defined by the color line. And so, this is part of what I'm talking about. It is basically an exploitation of the darker sides of human nature for the purpose of attaining political power. And I think that it is an intoxicating feeling for people to feel like they are bonding with other people who are like them, against an enemy who wants to destroy them because it makes them feel righteous. Now, it's simply not the case. Like, this is a myth. Like, when Donald Trump goes and says, I may be, a bastard, but I'm your bastard, and I'm protecting you from them, from the apocalypse, from the destruction of your way of life. That's not really true. That is an apocalyptic mindset he's cultivating for the purpose of winning political power. But for the people who he is talking to, it feels very real. And I think that, and so when he attacks those people who are outside of their community, they enjoy it because they understand it as a kind of act of resistance against people who are oppressing them. And even though that's an inversion of what's actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said that economic anxiety is a myth. One of the things that you're seeing being very pervasive is cultural anxiety, and he plays into that. One of my last questions for you before I let you go, because I think listeners are going to have to unpack this, because you were just utterly brilliant. You're one of the most
Thank you.
brilliant people I talk to every day, not named Roland Martin.
Well, Roland, I mean, Roland's, he's the king.
He's a legend. That's right. Let me ask you this. Is it possible for Republicans to separate out white national politics or white nationalist politics from their party's base politics and identity? Can they separate that cruelty and still have the party, a party that's viable or successful?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think again, this is a question of, in some sense, integration. I mean, to the extent that the Republican Party serves a more diverse constituency, both ideologically and culturally, racially, they will become a more tolerant party. There's always going to be people who have conservative views on religion. In fact, many of them vote for the Democratic Party right now. But there are always going to be people who have conservative views on religion, who have conservative views on economics, who have conservative views on immigration. That's never going to go away. But the kind of politics that we're talking about is a function of a system that rewards that kind of politics because of the influence it grants to certain constituencies, whether it's through gerrymandering in the House, whether it's through malapportionment in the Senate, or whether it's through the Electoral College. So I want to, like, in some ways, I'm trying to depersonalize it. I really do think that this is a function of our system. And to the extent that Democrats actually want to prevent or make this kind of politics less viable, they really have to work to make the system fairer, which is something that they have proven unable to do as of yet.
Where can folks find your book?
They can find my book anywhere. I encourage you to shop from your local indie. If you don't know where that is, you can check out IndieBound, which has a list of those. Obviously, we want to make sure that smaller businesses, that all your book buying business doesn't go to Amazon. But thank you for having me on the show, and I hope your audience will check it out.
Man, you've been it's a blessing to all my listeners. Give a shout out to Adam. Thank you so much for coming on the Bakari Sellers podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's gonna be